I'm ready to now.
Okay.
Well, my name is Audrey Goodfriend, and I live in Berkeley, California, but grew up in New York City, but have been in California much more than 2/3 of my life. And how I got to be born is one of my favorite stories. And I love to tell this, especially to anarchists, because the name of the story is I Am Born Because of an Agent Provocateur. So I think that's, I love that. Okay, how my mother and father met. So I tell you about my father and I have to tell you about my mother, right? That's
Yeah.
how. And my father had become a Jewish socialist in Warsaw, Poland as a very young man. He was working as an apprentice, and there was a big working class movement there, the Yiddish Bund, and he was protesting at a May Day parade before World War I, like 1912 or 13. And Poland belonged to Russia at the time, and they were all these kids were arrested, and the family, poor and very Orthodox religious, was really worried that he would be drafted or sent away to Siberia or put in jail and sent to Siberia. They decided they better raise some funds and get him to come to the United States, which they did. I don't know how they raised the funds. I never got that from my father. And I don't know what boat he came on, but I know he came on a boat and was below deck for a long, long time, arrived in Baltimore, and was going to his uncle, his mother's brother, who had come earlier and was living in Chicago. So he was going to his uncle in Chicago. He was known as Dead Uncle. And he said he didn't, Baltimore at that time, harbor was a really, really awful place. He couldn't believe how awful this golden land was looking when they had such different visions of what America was like. Warsaw was a beautiful city with parks and trees and everything else, and here he came to essentially an area that was slum. But he got to Chicago and got a job his trade was bookbinding. He got a job as a bookbinder in a factory in Chicago, and met a man who was an anarchist and introduced him to the theosladehome. And they had discussions about socialism versus anarchism, and my father became an anarchist. Also went to school and was learning English, and had learned English. And then there was an international young people's anarchist group in Chicago that my father was part of. And this was a time that Emma Goldman was really, really active in the United States, going around trying to get people to protest the draft, if not be drafted, and anti-war, and she was locked up lots of time. At that time in the United States, any young man was stopped on the street, and if he hadn't registered for the draft, they were sent to jail. My father, fortunately enough, was not old enough factually to be 18, because, again, the Orthodox Jews in Europe didn't want their children to go into the army, and they didn't register them until they were a couple of years old, which they were able to do. So my father's official papers had him younger. So he was able to be in the streets and hand out leaflets and do things and not be arrested. And he was part of this group that was trying to evade the law, just because some of them were young and would have been drafted. But amongst them, a person he was living with, sharing a room with, not an apartment, just sharing a room, another who was part of this group. And this group was not involved in direct action and bomb throwing. They were not doing anything that Chicago is known for, like the Haymarket, right? They were not doing anything like that. But this man, whose name now I don't remember, was trying to incite everybody to do something, like throw a bomb or shoot somebody up or something. And then they discovered that he had been planted as an agent provocateur. And he is now my father's roommate. And this really frightened my father. And he decided, oh God, I better get away, because who knows what they've got on me, And he packed up and he came to New York City. And they knew, in New York City, meanwhile, there was a boarding place in Harlem, where a woman who had children, she had been in Stelton with her young children. She and the father had split up, and she had to make a living for her family. And she moved to New York City and rented a big, big house where young anarchist men and women who were working and needed a place to live and someone to cook for them, because all of them were immigrants. And so Ida had this place in Harlem, and my father moved there. It was a place for him. My mother, so my father's living there. My mother was raised also by a very, very, very Orthodox mother. Jewish women didn't have to learn how to read and write. They just had to say the prayers and, memorize them. And my mother was an apprentice garment worker. She was learning how to become a seamstress. At that time, in Russia, Poland, young Yiddish women whose parents were able to send them to school, so many of them became radicalized and became socialists. And what they would do is they would try to organize, proselytize Jewish women, men and women, or in the little towns, the shtetl, known as the shtetl, organize them. And so some young women came to my mother's hometown, which was Tedesbol, and got a few women together, and they were doing totally, it was illegal. Again, this was total illegal. They had to take them, my mother says, into the forest. These young women go into the forest and they learn how to read and write, and they learned also about socialism and the Tsar, and and so my mother was radicalized and kicked religion. And she found it really, really hard to live with her mother. Her father had been dead since she was a baby back. So her mother was and she was the youngest child. And she found it just impossible to live with her mother. So meanwhile, this woman, Ida, was from her hometown, who was running so she came to Ida. At this time, Ida was still living in New Jersey with her family. That's where my mother came to Ida's house and knew Ida. And then Ida, and my mother's living in Newark, because they were living in Newark, New Jersey. Then when Ida moves to New York, my mother moves also into this house. And she's working in New York, and she also needs a place to live. So my mother and father and other men and women, young men and women, are living in this house. There are about 8 people besides Ida and her children living there. And the Spanish flu, this was now post-World War, the war has ended now, it's right at the end of World War II. And, I'm sorry, World War I. World War I. And the war has ended, and the Spanish flu is taking over. A lot of people are sick. And my mother comes home from work one day, and the men and women all ate together, because I just cooked for a bunch of people. And they said, and the interesting thing is that all the Jewish anarchists that I knew, this is a little aside, all the men were called by their last names, and the women were called by their first names. So my father was always called by his last name, which was Goodfriend in Yiddish, and other people, I had friends, there was Karpov was the man, and the woman's was Pola. Fliesel was the woman, and the wife was Fanny. I mean, it was just, I don't know why. I would sometimes like to know why that was amongst those people, but as it is. So my mother came home from work and said, where is Goodfriend? Because they spoke Yiddish. Where is Goodfriend? Be his Goodfriend. They said, oh, he came home and he wasn't feeling well somehow. And my mother went up to his room, because apparently she had her eyes on him all along. They were not coupled, but she had her eyes on him. And she went up there, and he was very, very sick. And she kind of took care of him. She nursed him. And then, I don't know how many months after this situation, I was the result. So, I mean, if there hadn't been an agent provocateur, I would not have been born. My father would have remained in Chicago, and he would not have met my mother. So, anyway, here I am. Here I am. And I'll beware of agent provocateurs.
Great.